And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich and I are joined by Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News and the Big Ten Network for a wide-ranging off-season discussion that begins with a discussion of an article Mike recently wrote about how there isn't as big of an advantage as we think for coaches like Bill Self, who coached Team USA. So we get into that with him. And we also dive into some Romeo Langford talk. We talk about how good Mike thinks Romeo can be as a freshman, how powerful he thinks the combo of Romeo and Juwan Morgan can be together, and then what he thinks is the biggest question mark for Indiana that will determine just how good this team can be, as well as a look around the Big Ten, and then a discussion of where Archie Miller fits into the current hierarchy of Big Ten coaches. All of that and more on this edition of Podcast on the Brink. And coming up right now, you will either hear an ad, some of you, or you will go right into the discussion with Mike DeCourcy. So either way, we'll see you on the other side talking with Mike DeCourcy. And we are joined on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink by one of our favorite recurring guests, Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News and the Big Ten Network. Mike, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Gentlemen, how are you? Always a delight to talk to you.
We are doing well, trying to navigate, this slower time in the college basketball offseason. But just because it's slow doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of topics to discuss. And one that I wanted to talk about with you to kick things off here is an article that you wrote recently over at the Sporting News. The headline, "Controversy over recruiting advantage for USA basketball coaches is overblown." And so I want to get your thoughts on this because, I think Indiana fans, you see Bill Self coaching the under-18 team, and there are people like Trace Jackson Davis on that team that, Indiana is heavily involved in. And you kind of look at it and it's like, wait a minute, why is the coach of Kansas getting to build the relationship with these guys? And, this has to be a big advantage for these coaches. And just at first glance, it certainly seems like it would be, but you think that that's a little bit overblown. Why do you think that?
I think that we've seen through the course of these tournaments over the last decade or so that it hasn't turned out to be an enormous advantage. In some cases, it's been a disadvantage. You get yelled at. Maybe you don't, and most times in recruiting, it's all, sunshine and balloons. When you are playing in a competitive tournament and practicing to compete in that tournament, sometimes you're going to get yelled at maybe. And sometimes you maybe not play as much as you'd like to. Or maybe you get taken out of a game when you don't want to. But it all adds up to the fact that there have been 9 teams at the under 18 or under 19 level since 2007, I believe, that have been coached by college coaches that had recruitable athletes. The 10th team, coached by Jamie Dixon and Matt Painter, and I can't remember who the third assistant was, in 2009, was strictly college players, and Gordon Hayward and Klay Thompson were among the players on that team, and they won the world championship at the U19 level. But every other team at the 18s or 19s had at least one or more recruitable players. And out of the 43 recruitable players that were on those teams, only 4 wound up playing for anybody on the staff in college. It was always the head coach. It was Sean Miller got Alonzo Trier, and having watched Alonzo's career, there were pluses and minuses to that win. And Texas got 2 players for Shaka Smart, and then last year John Calipari got Emmanuel Quickly. But there also were circumstances like Romeo Langford's, where he played for John, and at that point Kentucky was on his list, and he wound up not playing for him. And afterward, Mr. Langford was not very complimentary of John and how that went down. Lewis King was on that team, went to Oregon. Cam Reddish was on that team, went to Duke. And Ball, who was reported, rumored, whatever, to be a Kentucky lean going into the trials, was cut. And it was kind of one of those deals where he was certainly very good at times and not great at others, and would have been kind of a different player to have. And the committee that makes those decisions. Remember, it's not just the head coach that chooses the team. There's a panel of 8 or 9 coaches, usually very accomplished coaches, that helps put the team together. And they cut Ball. And then not long after that, Kentucky wasn't the favorite anymore. He wound up going to Oregon.
So, Mike, you mentioned this committee that helps, assist picking the team. Do you think that's how much do you think the actual coach of the team has in terms of who's cut and who's not? And, last year, the example you mentioned with John Calipari, do you think in the future it will maybe discourage coaches from wanting to do this based on the fact that maybe he lost out on some guys that he was in good position with before?
I think that those guys do it to help basketball, to make American basketball better. In some cases, it's an advantage. Some cases, a disadvantage. I think they look at it as a wash, and try to make the game of basketball better in America. And I respect them for that, and I think that they deserve more credit for that than to be criticized as the case. You can say you're criticizing the policy. But there was a particular person executing the policy, and that person's not out of the line of fire. And I think that that you give up as the coach of that team minimum 3 weeks, maybe a little more. And in most of those cases, you're completely away from your family for that entire period of time. That's a pretty serious undertaking, and I respect all the coaches that have done that. And Arch is one of them. He did 2 summers, 18s and 19s. When Sean was the head coach, and it's quite a commitment. At that point, Arch had his kids were pretty little. His girl, I believe, the one would have been 3-4 years old maybe, and he did it anyway because he wanted to be a part of this. He wants to be better. The other thing that you have to remember is helps make you better as a coach too. It's like going to a clinic in a lot of ways, because you have to figure out how to deal with the coaches and players from the other side. And so there are lots of ways in which it benefits you, even if you never get a player out of it. But there are also the costs of, being away from leisure time, family time, and the operation of your program as well.
Mike, the other big story that's obviously big this week is the NBA draft. And you had a tweet recently. You said, "We've come to that portion of pre-draft analysis where we're told all about how the prospects were misused by their college coaches. Yay." So I read this tweet and I started, kind of going down the list of prospects. Okay, DeAndre Ayton. Yeah, they've said that about, Sean Miller, Jaren Jackson, Miles Bridges. Yeah, they've said that about Izzo, Wendell Carter. Yeah, they've said that about him. And, so kind of going on. And obviously for Indiana, there's not much of a connection to this year's draft, but you can certainly project forward to next year with Romeo Langford and, kind of see how this may end up getting said about Archie Miller. So I'm wondering, what is your primary issue with how often this statement gets made by people who are NBA draft analysts, NBA analysts, but not necessarily college basketball analysts?
Well, I think part of it is that, remember, when that kid goes into a college, he's not necessarily ready to do all the things that he may be ready to do by the end of the year. The idea that Wendell Carter should be out there shooting 3-pointers or shooting 15-footers as a college player, it's not logical. He wasn't misused. He's 6'11", and they've got guys who can shoot the ball. Wendell Carter's the only guy that they have that's 6'11", 290 or whatever the heck he is, and a massive presence in the lane. It sort of frosts me because the games are somewhat different. The possessions mean more in college. There are fewer of them. 30 seconds is a different kind of clock, and the game's shorter. So you can't just be out there entertaining some guy's idea of, well, I got to work on my game. It's great that those guys can do that, and you've got facilities to deal with it, and certainly it's good that Wendell Carter can shoot the basketball, and maybe a skill that comes in handy at some point during a game, but it's not something he's going to do regularly. And the other component of that is, using an example with Kentucky, Carl Towns. When Carl Towns went to Kentucky, Carl Towns hadn't been within 10 feet of the basket his entire high school career practically. I mean, he loved to shoot the basketball from the perimeter. He developed that. At Kentucky, they made him learn to play in the post. That's why he's so good now, because he can do all of that stuff. He's still a tremendous three-point shooter that he developed by the time he was a sophomore in high school. But now he can play in the low post and own the baseline, and that's why he's a tremendous player. He wasn't misused at Kentucky. He was developed at Kentucky. He was expanded. They're saying now, well, Kevin Knox should have been playing at the 4 spot in college instead of the 3. Well, I mean, for one, they had guys to do that. That's why he wasn't. 2, he wanted to be a 3 so that he could work on his perimeter game, and it fit into what they needed. And 3, there's almost no difference between a 3 and a 4 in college now anyway. It's just basically who you guard. So, that's a lot of that stuff is just, these guys got to fill a lot of time between the time the college season ends and this actual draft happens. So I guess they got to talk about something. But I think that particular criticism a lot of times rings hollow.
Okay, it is time for a couple of quick ads. Some of you will hear these ads, others of you will not. Either way, we get into talking about Romeo Langford next, about the questions Indiana faces, talking about the Big Ten, Archie Miller, all of that coming up here either immediately or right after a couple of ads.
Mike, obviously a lot has transpired with Indiana since we last spoke, most notably the commitment and signing of Romeo Langford for the Hoosiers. I'm curious, from your perspective, were you surprised, just based on the twists and turns of this recruitment, that Romeo ultimately ended up in Bloomington? And also, what kind of expectations are fair for him next season as he goes into what may be his only season of college basketball?
Yeah, I think that I was not at all surprised that he chose Indiana. Once he cut his list down to Kansas and Vanderbilt and Indiana was the logical choice. Kansas, Kansas has a great program and Bill's a great coach, but the opportunity to be a hometown hero, so to speak, Kansas already has a lot of guys, it's not that Romeo couldn't have found a spot somewhere, but the other thing about Kansas is that the guys that they have, a lot of them have been in the program, and they didn't play much this year. I mean, like Dedrick Lawson didn't play; he was a transfer, but he's been there, and so he's got an advantage over you. You're coming in as a freshman. He's not only a veteran college player with 2 years in the books at Memphis, but he's also, a veteran of a year at Kansas system. So if you do wind up in a fight with him for minutes, or with his brother KJ, it might be a little bit of a challenge because of that advantage for them. So Indiana, less competition in that regard. They've got guys who've been in the program certainly, but they don't have anybody as gifted as he is. So I think that it absolutely made perfect sense for him to choose Indiana. In regards to what to expect, I think that's where it gets tricky because honestly, Romeo is a really gifted player, but he's a very gifted all-around player. He contributes in a lot of ways. And this class, even though he's at the top of this class, it's not an overwhelmingly gifted class. So, I'm not sure whether Romeo in, say, 2016 or 2017 would have been, a top 5, top 6 player. I think he would have been closer to the low double figures, 11, 12, 13, somewhere in there. And, when you're in that range, it's not as, people don't expect you to walk in and just absolutely dominate. They expect you to be very good, and he will be very good. But I don't think he's going to be a dominant player, a guy who puts up humongous numbers. And so I hope that people don't hang that on him when he's out there, getting 14, 15, doing all the little things, passing the basketball, defending, making smart plays because he's a really intelligent player and really understands how to impact the game. When I went out to Colorado Springs last year, speaking of the under-19s, and watched him try out, that's what I wrote about. That all the little things. He's like I said he was like a perfect player because the flaws aren't there. He doesn't do dumb stuff, and and when there's a smart play to be made, he's always on the right side of it. So that's what I think. That's what's a reasonable expectation for him. For him to once he gets a handle on what Arch wants from him, which won't take very long, but you can't expect it like day one. But once he gets a handle on that, he'll know what to do, and he'll know how to be really good. But I don't think that he's going to be out there on a regular basis throwing in 25 points a night. If he does it, great, but I don't think that's the expectation. The expectation is make Indiana better by all the things that he adds to a basketball team, and I absolutely 100% expect him to do that.
Well, unfortunately, he will have help in the form of JaJuan Morgan. Weren't quite sure there for a little while if he was going to come back for his senior year, but he decided to. And you look at Indiana, and you've got the two of those guys, Romeo and JaJuan, and then a lot of question marks, and we'll get to those question marks in a second. But that tandem of Romeo and JaJuan, how good can they be together? And as you look around the Big Ten and look at the other kind of top 1-2 punches in the conference, where do you rate Romeo and JaJuan?
Well, they're very far up there. I mean, I think a healthy, Minnesota tandem, for instance, Jordan Murphy is just tremendous, and Curry is really good. And so they've got, they've got 2 or 3 guys. I mean, so that's a start. If Maryland had gotten all their guys back, maybe they'd be in that conversation, but they didn't. So Michigan State has a nice collection of players, but they lost their highest rated players. So I'm not sure there are very many teams that have 2 players that dynamic, who can be that influential in a game. For Indiana, the difference between being, at this point, when I see some people say top 25, I think that's a bit ambitious. I'm not saying it's totally out of reach, but I think we learned this past year the difference between Indiana being a threat like they were a lot of nights and Indiana being a good team was that the point guard play. And so when you tell me what Indiana's point guard situation is going to be and that answer is good, then maybe at that point I start to listen to you saying because of those 2 guys and some of the other really talented guys they have coming back that they can be top 25. But until I know that that's covered, I still say getting into the tournament is a reasonable expectation.
Well, there we go. You just answered my next question because it was going to be what is the biggest, the biggest question that has to be answered in a positive way for Indiana. And there are a lot of, question marks on the roster. How healthy will Deron Davis be? Is Justin Smith ready to evolve? But point guard is a big one. And it looks like there are 2 options. Either you've got a junior in Devante Green who steps it up, becomes more consistent, becomes more focused, and there's a lot more good Devante than bad Devante, or you're thrusting it on the shoulders of someone like a freshman in Robert Finney. As you look forward for Indiana, what is your expectation, just based on what you know of those guys, for how that will play out?
Well, Devante had some shots at it last year, and it didn't quite take. But it's not. It wouldn't be unprecedented. He's a very capable basketball player. Part of this is about putting guys in position to succeed. And if Devante isn't comfortable as a point guard, then you're diminishing yourself in a sense at 2 spots because he's certainly good enough to play for you away from the ball if he's not ready to be a point guard. So that's a factor. I hope it works out for him because I like him. I think he's athletic enough. He's dynamic enough. He's experienced enough. And then it's just a question of being comfortable enough with what's demanded of the point guard. And if he is, then Indiana's better. And then that takes some of the pressure off Robert Finney to be ready to go on day one or something like that. And if that's covered, then then everybody else starts to fit really well together, and you look at it, and you've got multiple options with JaJuan Morgan. You can play him at the 5 as you did last year, or you can play him with a big like Duran. You've got I really think when you look at this team, guys like Justin Smith and Al Durham, those guys have. I mean, they're really, really high levels of potential, but again, still, need to be developed a little bit, or at least needed to be developed, I should say, from the close of when we saw them last to the start of next year. And so, if those guys make significant progress, then Indiana starts to become a really exciting team.
Mike, the Big Ten at large to me is interesting going into next season because I'm seeing a lot of predictions, and myself, I did my offseason Big Ten power rankings, and I put Michigan State as the favorite right now, but I don't feel strongly about that. And I got some feedback from some people that weren't too happy that I think Wisconsin has a chance to be one of those top teams in the Big Ten as well. But when you look at the league from top to bottom, it seems, it almost seems like we're saying this every year, but it's wide open on paper. Is that kind of how you see it as well?
Well, I think so, because so many guys that could have made it, so many guys that could have made this like their year in the Big Ten. Like Maryland, although they haven't really ever, since they joined the league, just put a hammer on things. They could have been the team if Justin Jackson and Kevin Huerter had come back. Justin decided to go because he'd been banged up, and Kevin's now playing himself or being mocked into the first round. So I'm not sure that either made a bad choice, but if they were back, Maryland would be a really exciting team. Penn State, Tony Carr deciding to go, again, another huge difference maker in what Penn State might have been. And, I didn't expect Michigan State to get their guys back, but again, an opportunity there to have been a dominant team if they'd gotten at least one back. And so I think that without all of those players coming back, and remember, we're not talking about a lot of guys, that were no-brainer, I have to be in the draft guys that left. A lot of those guys were maybe iffy kind of guys, and it broke one way. And so with that, you're looking at a league that doesn't have on paper the obvious strength that it had a year ago. I think that Michigan still has a chance to be very good. Michigan State, chance to be very good. Like you said, Wisconsin, they could be a very exciting team. Iowa could maybe decide to really commit the defense, and then all the players that they have, and they do have some good players, could form a really good team. And Indiana has some possibilities, and Purdue. They've got some good players and lost a lot. But they, when you've got a player like Carson Edwards, you certainly can't say write it off. So I don't think that the top of the league is quite as strong as it was a year ago when Michigan State came into the season looking really strong, rated top 2 or 3 by most people. But I think it's going to be pretty balanced and pretty interesting. And there are opportunities there for a lot of teams to make significant steps forward.
One last question for you, Mike. We know that you've got some World Cup action to get back to, so we really appreciate you taking the time. Look, one season at a school is not enough to judge a coach and judge a fit and judge what he's going to be long term. But now that you've seen Archie in Bloomington for a year, how would you kind of assess the hierarchy of Big Ten coaches and where Archie fits into that?
Well, Arch is a terrific coach, and when he took the job, I was very enthusiastic about it, and even more so after I attended his first day press conference and realized how great the fit would be. And I don't think anything about that has changed. And I thought he's been really smart about recruiting. He did everything right recruiting wise in his first year. And now what I'd said at the time, and I think we discussed this on the podcast, was that the first year was about establishing a great core of players who will be with you for a while, reestablishing yourself in the state of Indiana, and then taking a big swing at getting Romeo Langford. And if you hit it, great, and it is great. And if you miss, that's okay because you came in late. But they got it done. And so, the second year, they're involved with, slightly more glamorous players, bigger prospects, the kind of guys who can come in and complement the core of players who will be in place and be difference makers if you can get them. And so I think all of that's working out well. The difference between Arch and the more established coaches in the league, those guys, like Tom Izzo and John Beeline, Matt Painter, those guys have all been in their jobs for a very long time, all a decade or more. And so they know they know how to do their job, which is, the Michigan State job or the Michigan job or the Purdue job, as opposed to just being a head coach. I mean, Arch knows as well as he needs to how to be a head coach, but how to be the Indiana coach is something that he's still learning. And he won't have mastered it until he has a couple of very successful seasons. And at that point, he'll know, how to be successful at Indiana, how to repeat success at Indiana, and how to, turn it into its own machine where, you just have to make sure that you press all the right pedals and don't mess it up. And I think all of that's coming because I really believe in him as a coach, having watched him, work. Basically, I've followed his entire coaching career because I knew him through his brother and through his father as a player at NC State. And then, I knew him. So I knew when he went to work for Darren Horn at Western Kentucky, I was able to follow him there and on to Ohio State and Arizona State and all the rest. He's someone whose career I've watched develop. And so I know he hasn't taken any shortcuts. He's continued to do things to become a better coach and to grow as a coach like USA basketball. And, he's in the right place for him now, and Indiana's got the right coach for the job. It just takes a little time for all that to come to fruition.
Yep, and hopefully the first of those successful seasons that you mentioned will happen this season. But we will we will have to wait and see. But he is Mike DeCourcy. Follow him on Twitter at TSN Mike. Mike, thank you so much for joining us again on Podcast on the Brink.
Jerod and
Thanks,
Alex,
Mike.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.